Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. Few stories in human history are as gripping as the biblical tale of David and Goliath. Most cultures have their own equivalent in which a beleaguered people are saved from the overwhelming force of evil at the last moment by a well-aimed shot from a young hero. Hollywood regularly reinvents the tale. Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones. That's perhaps why people around the world are rallying to the support of Ukraine's David. But the grim reality unfolding for President Zelensky's people is far from the tale we tell our children. Most of the time, in most places, the story is one of suffering, of loss, and of death. And then Goliath wins. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll ask what the rest of the world can do besides wring its hands and discuss whether this time hope can triumph over experience, with those calling the shots here at home and with testimony from those in the line of fire, including our colleagues here at Sky. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, will be here to tell us more about what the government's planning to do to help the people of Ukraine. The Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, will give us Labour's view. What is it like for those living in fear of Russian attacks in Ukraine's towns and cities? Kiev resident Anastasia Krishka will tell us. Air Marshal Philip Osborn is a former head of Defence Intelligence. He'll tell us what more he thinks Britain could do to help Ukraine defend itself. Former US Ambassador to NATO, Volker, will tell us what he thinks the alliance needs to do to thwart Russian aggression before it's too late. And I'll be talking to financial security expert Tom Keatinge about whether economic sanctions really will make a difference. The CBI's chief economist, Rain Newton-Smith, will give us her prediction of the knock-on effects of the war on the UK economy. And how far is Beijing prepared to back Vladimir Putin? China expert Yun Sun will be here to tell us. And Ruth Smith, CEO of Index on Censorship, will give us her thoughts on the latest crackdown on press freedom in Russia. But first, Dominic Raab joins me now. Good morning, Deputy Prime Minister.
Good morning, Trevor.
What can you tell us this morning about the state of the Russian advance, particularly on the key cities of Kiev, Odessa and Mariupol?
Well, of course, Putin came in and had sold to the Russian people, but also to his conscripts on the ground in Ukraine, that this would be far easier than it's turned out. That is partly a testament to the resilience and the courage of the Ukrainian people. And, of course, we've been supporting them with training through Operation Orbital, which has trained over 22,000 Ukrainian armed forces. Also, the anti-tank missiles, 2,000 that we provided them, and the wider international community. But they have definitely proved a tougher prospect than Putin expected, and that has an effect on morale on the Russian side as well. Of course, at the same time, we've imposed the biggest sanctions package I can remember, with devastating consequences in terms of the ruble, fallen to record low, the stock market, and also we've seen the Russian central bank, which itself has been subject to sanctions, doubling interest rates. That has put the squeeze on Putin. What he's now doing is responding with ever more brutal tactics to try and wrest back the initiative. I think the bottom line is none of the major cities have yet fallen, but I think we ought to be under no doubt that our mission with our allies is to ensure Putin fails in Ukraine. That is going to take some time. We're talking about months, if not years, and therefore we'll have to show some strategic stamina, because this is not going to be over in days.
Well, let's unpack some of that and let's deal with some of the immediate issues. The Red Cross says that the Russians have broken the ceasefire by shelling civilians. This is actually your own professional field as a lawyer, and you've prosecuted war criminals. This must be a war crime, mustn't it?
Well, you're right that the reckless and, frankly, appalling tactics by the Putin regime must be held to account. Not just Putin himself, but also anyone taking illegal orders. And so on top of the £220 million of humanitarian support we're providing to the Ukrainian people, we're also very clear that as the International Criminal Court opens its examination of what's taking place, and it's right that a court decides whether war crimes have been committed, we will provide the support that diplomatic support. We've been part of the countries that have referred this to the ICC. But also, we've got a history from Nuremberg onwards of supporting war crimes prosecutions, whether it's through forensic evidence or right the way through to, of course, Charles Taylor, Radovan Karadzic are here in British jails. And we'll do whatever it takes. We've got a huge amount of experience. And I would also just say it's part of what we do as a country as a force for good. You have a British prosecutor at the ICC. There's a British judge, Joe Corner. They're independent, but it is part of what we do to support those institutions and hold Putin to account.
Just to be clear, someone can be prosecuted in absentia. They don't have to be there at the ICC. And it doesn't actually matter that you might say, a commander might say, I was only following orders. Just to be absolutely clear, anybody who takes steps that will be defined as a war crime can be and will be prosecuted, if you have your way, at the ICC. Whether they turn up, they don't turn up, whether they are Putin himself or they're a captain on the ground.
Well, of course, the ICC is independent. We need to respect the prosecutorial judicial independence. So these are decisions for them to make. What I'm saying is it is absolutely right that there is rigorous, full accountability for anything that happens. And the fact that the ICC is looking at this is something that we don't just support as a, if you like, political measure because we're a state party to the ICC, but also we will do what it takes with nuts and bolts cooperation to try and help them. And the point, I guess, at this point in time, while the conflict is raging, is to preserve as much evidence as we can.
And they need to know this, is your point?
My point, the here and now in all of this, is I want, and we want, and the ICC is making clear, that for all of those commanders on the ground, right through to the people around Putin in the Kremlin, what they do now, whether they give or whether they follow illegal orders to commit war crimes, they will be held to account for it. And they need to know that. And will it affect morale? It often does in these types of situations.
You and I have spoken before about your own family's flight from the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. More than 1 million people are fleeing Ukraine. The UN says maybe 1.5 million have crossed borders. What are we doing to help people get out to neighbouring states?
Well, as I said, we've provided over £200 million in humanitarian assistance. We'll work with the international agencies, obviously the UN, and those European countries that are closest to Ukraine. It always happens that people want to go if they have to leave their home country, and that is hugely traumatic. They'll want to go, or they tend to want to go to places which are as close as possible because they'll want to go back as soon as conditions on the ground help. We've also made it clear, both in relation to dependents of Brits here who are Ukrainian or Ukrainians living here, that we will provide the visa flexibility. So we estimate up to 200,000 could come here. And on top of that, there is a humanitarian protection mechanism that the Home Secretary has set up to allow the charitable business or individual sponsorship of those to come here from Ukraine.
I want to come to the visa regime in a moment, but just sticking with what is happening on the borders there. We've seen in recent times the flow of civilians from conflicts being used, essentially weaponised, to destabilise other states. Belarus did that and so on. Are you concerned that Putin will use this flow to destabilise Poland, Moldova, Romania, or, frankly, as human shields for his own troops?
I think anything is possible. You look at what Putin has done in the past, in all the wars he's been involved in, you look at the tactics in Syria, I don't think that there is any tactic he wouldn't resort to. But I would say this, I think NATO and Central and Eastern European countries are absolutely resolute, and we will support them to the hilt in not allowing that to be the case. I think the impact Putin will have on NATO, on the resilience and the resolve of Central and Eastern European countries will be the opposite of what he wishes. I think it will only steel their nerve, and we will support them all the way.
All right, let's talk about some, if I can put it this way, more difficult questions. President Zelensky has called for a no-fly zone to be established by NATO. NATO, and in particularly our government, you have responded by saying that such a step would provoke a Europe-wide conflict. Surely the humanitarian crisis playing out before our eyes is going to change the calculus over that?
Well, I think the humanitarian situation is something we're going to constantly need to innovate and evolve in our response to, and ultimately try and stem and prevent. But the reality is that it's not just the UK, it's all of the NATO allies. The US has been the same, European partners have been the same. We're not going to either get ourselves into a direct military conflict with Putin, either because that would be a massive escalation, but also that feeds Putin's narrative. Putin wants to say that he's actually in a struggle with the West. He's not. This is an illegal invasion of a neighbour whose self-determination, democratic and territorial integrity needs to be protected. We do not want to feed Putin's narrative.
Yeah, but you've just spent quite a lot of time telling me how much money, how much effort we're putting in to protecting people. The truth of the matter is we already know that he's not that bothered about damage done to civilians, and that the humanitarian corridors could be vulnerable. The American diplomat Kurt Volker, from whom we'll be hearing later in this programme, said to me this week that when the bodies start piling up in the tens of thousands, the position on the no-fly zone will change. Why not do it now and save those tens of thousands of lives? If we really, really want to protect those people, the no-fly zone, even if it's limited to Kiev and the corridors of safety, surely it's time to start that now.
Look, I understand the argument, and there's head and heart in all of this, but the reality is we don't think, and our allies don't think, we ought to be sucked into a direct military conflict with Vladimir Putin. And that's the position that we've taken. Of course, it would be different if he was attacking a NATO ally. The position around NATO is very clear. But we will do everything short of that to support the Ukrainians. And I understand the debate around it.
Well, you say everything short of that, but you know how that will be heard in Ukraine. We are prepared to do anything up to the point where it will make a difference.
Well, no, I don't think that's true. First of all, I think the efficacy of no-fly zones, if you look at history, you can think of the Iraq example. They're very difficult, they're very challenging. Secondly, if you look at the impact of our sanctions, and the UK has been at the vanguard of the international response, I think the fact that Putin and the Russian central bank have doubled interest rates to 20%, we think of what the cost of living challenges we're facing here, I do think that not only puts a squeeze on the Putin war machine, but also it shows the ordinary Russian people that this idea that this is in their interest is for the birds. So at every level, I think the sanctions will have an impact, but they won't do so overnight.
Indeed. That's the point.
That's the bit I accept.
That is the point. The problem is, for the people of Ukraine, overnight is what matters. Now is what matters. And this geopolitics of it and so on, frankly, they may appreciate, but it doesn't save them. And let's just deal with the point you made, by the way, 200,000 people you think may come to the United Kingdom. Now, last week your colleague Liz Truss said to me that at the same time on Sunday, UK couldn't commit to admitting any Ukrainians with family here. By that evening, Priti Patel had eased the rules a bit, and that was widely criticised. And Friday night, you fell into line with the rest of the EU and agreed to admit people with family here. The point I'm making is, why not just take the next step now, rather than having to be dragged over days to get to do the right thing?
I mean, in fairness, Trevor, I think if you look the Hong Kong British National Overseas Citizens, if you look at Operation Pitting and what we did for those Afghans fleeing, and our history as a country, I think we've always stepped up, and we have here. But you're right to say that we looked and adjusted the family dependence
It wasn't an adjust. That was a 180-degree turn. Your colleague sat there and said, no, we can't do that. By Friday night, you were doing it.
And absolutely, we responded very swiftly. And I think that's the right thing to do, and for all the reasons that you've given, and I've always felt that we should be open-hearted. By the way, on that, if we started abrogating security checks on those coming from a war zone, I think, first of all, it would be the wrong thing to do. We've got to look at our security. Secondly, I think you'd see public support, which has been incredible, very moving and overwhelming. I think you would start to see that fray. In the same way as, let's be honest, if we were engaged in a military direct conflict with Vladimir Putin, I think the consensus about what we're doing would also fray. So just to be clear about this, you've got to think these things through, and we've got to be measured as well as resolute.
All right, look, but isn't the point here that what seems to happen is not so much that you're reacting to events, but you're being dragged to events, and that actually what you're really doing is following rather than leading? On sanctions, on the refugees, you've issued stirring press releases, then changed the position. Don't you? Is it what we're seeing here, a government which doesn't want to take the political risks that are actually involved in truly confronting Putin?
Well, I just don't think that's true on the facts, if I may say so, Trevor. Let me give you the example of sanctions. We were out ahead. And if you take Russian banks, we have sanctioned more Russian banks than the EU, including Sberbank, the biggest Russian bank. If you take Russian companies, 3 million are subject to restrictions, which means they can't raise finance or be listed in the UK. That was well ahead of anything the EU has done. It's true that the sanctions approach of the US and the EU and the UK, they're not identical, but I'm afraid I do not accept your proposition. We've been at the vanguard. And actually, if you talk to ordinary Ukrainians, or indeed the Ukrainian ambassador, he has paid tribute, and they pay tribute to the resolve and the solidarity we've shown.
All right, let's take a very practical example. 3 weeks ago, Liz Truss told me that Putin's friends and associates, these are her words, would have no place to hide. Take a look at a picture I'm going to show you. This is a gentleman called General Sergei Shoigu. He is the Russian defense minister. He should turn up here. Here he is. There is Mr. Putin's closest associate he's running the campaign. He met our own defence minister 3 weeks ago on February 23rd, day before the invasion, sanctioned by the EU. 2 days later, sanctioned by the USA. 11 days after the Russians invaded, he is still not sanctioned by us. Why not?
Look, I'm always very careful not to talk about individuals because in relation to criminal prosecutions or sanctions, but let me answer the question. Let me answer the question squarely. But it's not right, actually, for me to prejudge any legal action we take. It's very serious. It needs to be done on the evidence and on the legal criteria.
11 days.
Yeah, but these things, you need to have evidence that he has got assets here.
So the EU and the USA are basically breaching... proper legal.
Well, I don't know in relation
sanctions?
to the facts, but first of all, you've got to have evidence of the legal criteria. He's also got to have assets. If you're talking about immediate action against assets in the UK, so we do have the rule of law in this country. We do these things carefully, and as a result of that, by the way, we have far more impact. When I introduced the Sergei Magnitsky sanctions for human rights abuses, but also for corruption, based on the biggest tax fraud in Russian history, we had all of these arguments about whether we moved more quickly, which we did in many cases also. But the reality is we avoided successful legal challenge against those sanctions. Nothing would be a greater PR coup for Putin than if we put sanctions on someone and then we found they were successfully appealed. So we do act swiftly, and that is important. We also need to make sure we can do so sustainably, because that's where the credibility comes from.
Will you then stop your colleague, the Prime Minister, going about saying that we've sanctioned 100 people?
Well, it's over 100 entities, and I think if you take since 2014, 250 individuals have been sanctioned. But
this person who has been sanctioned by pretty much everybody else isn't sanctioned by us.
You'll always be able to do this, Trevor. You'll be able to point to one or other. If you take the picture overall and look not just at individuals, but the corporate vehicles that they have assets through, banks, companies, as well as the individuals, we yield to no one in our record for not just moving swiftly, but also robustly. And again, those figures on banks and companies, 3 million Russian companies, and often you find the associates or the individuals are operating through those businesses or banks, cannot now list on the UK stock market, cannot now raise money loans in the UK.
All right, well, let's talk about how far we're prepared to go. The war's already caused a huge spike in energy costs. When you're going to tell the British people that they are going to have to pay a price here, and by the way, might it not be the moment for you to think again about that national insurance tax rise of 1.25%, given the pain that we're going to have to face?
Well, look, first of all, in terms of the funding of social care, I think we should be dealing with the social care problem. It's been ducked by successive governments. I'm proud that this government is going to deal with the social care challenge that so many people face. On energy prices, we've been very clear. If you have a global crisis, a conflict involving Russia or any other oil or gas producer, it's going to have an impact on global prices. In fact, we get just 4% of our gas from Russia, so we are much less reliant than others. But what we're going to do in terms of supply is keep expanding the renewables. We're going to invest more in nuclear, particularly those small nuclear reactors, and we're also going to make sure we can rely for resilience on the North Sea
but
production.
the price of energy is going to go up. We know that.
So let me tell you,
and the only way you're going to be able to protect people is by expanding supply. So, are you going to tell people that they're going to have to pay 1,000 and plus more? Or, by the way, are you going to think about returning to coal or fracking?
No, we're not going to do something. We're not going to return to coal. But I've given you the three areas: North Sea oil production, where we'll have more resilience; renewables; and nuclear, where we do need to increase supply, and that is already part of our strategy. In terms of protecting consumers, I mean, just to be clear, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have put £20 billion into the cost of living challenge that we face right now to protect consumers. £9 billion of that is to support with energy bills. So from the winter fuel payments through to the discounts and the rebates on council tax and energy bills, we're already providing this support to make sure we can see ourselves through what we hope will be a temporary crisis.
All right. Let's talk very briefly now about the potential endgame. Mr. Putin has said overnight that sanctions are an act of war. Do you fear that a cornered, isolated Kremlin, with its troops bogged down in a conflict that Mr. Putin didn't anticipate, could actually reach for the nuclear button?
No, I think the debate and the rhetoric around that is just that. But what it does show you, I mean, first of all, just to be clear, sanctions are not an act of war. International law was very clear about that. Our sanctions are entirely both legally justified but also proportionate to what we're trying to deal with. But what it does show you is that this has not been the cakewalk Putin expected. And it's not just us hearing that message, it's Russian people and those Russian conscripts who were told they were peacekeepers in Ukraine, who are finding fearsome resistance from the Ukrainians. But this was not what their commander-in-chief had promised them.
But I should say to you that he has said, I think it's come out this morning by the Russian news agency, that the Ukraine is developing a dirty nuclear bomb. No evidence for that whatsoever.
None.
But could that be preparation on his part for an escalation to the use of what I think ludicrously, but anyway, are called battlefield nuclear weapons?
I think it's rhetoric and brinkmanship, and Putin's at various times, I mean, he's got a track record as long as anyone's arm of misinformation and propaganda. We saw that through the pandemic. And this is a distraction from what the real issues are at hand, which is that it's an illegal invasion and it is not going according to plan. You're absolutely right, though, Trevor, to say that makes him even more unpredictable. And that's why working in the UN, working with our NATO allies, working with our international partners around the world, I mean, China has got a job here. They've got to step up as well. This is a permanent member of the Security Council. India as well. So we need to expand the diplomatic pressure, but let's not get distracted by the propaganda of Putin.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much. The Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Healey.
Good morning.
Does Dominic Raab's assessment of the military situation on the ground seem reasonable, given what you know?
Yes. The Russians may have seriously miscalculated the strength of the Ukrainian military. More importantly, Putin has miscalculated on the strength of Ukrainian national identity and their determination to resist in the face of this invasion and in the face of Putin coming in and killing people, bombing their cities in a sovereign state that Russia itself promised under international law to respect.
Where do you stand on the Ukrainian appeal for a no-fly zone, whether over the whole of Ukraine or, as has been suggested by some people, a limited zone of Kiev and the humanitarian corridors?
Yes, NATO has ruled this out, and the most essential thing is that the Western alliance remains together. It's done so because establishing a no-fly zone will mean shooting Russian fighters out of the sky. It will do too little to protect the Ukrainians from the artillery and missile fire now being directed into civilian neighborhoods. And the big risk is that it gives Putin the grounds to rapidly escalate this conflict. And of course, it gives him the get out of jail free card to explain to his own people why his military campaign and his invasion in Ukraine is not going well.
I'm going to be talking to a person on the ground in Ukraine. Tell me how I explain to her why we are not responding, because I hear what you've just said, but from her point of view, and I imagine from President Zelensky's point of view and most of his people, this feels like the West saying, we are happy to support you, except in order to do the thing that will really protect you.
This is genuinely, deeply, deeply disturbing, very difficult. And the hard fact is that the hard fact is Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so the collective security commitments that we have don't apply. But Britain has led the way rightly with Labour's full support in providing the military assistance for Ukrainians to defend themselves. When I was in Ukraine in January, the Ukrainians were very clear. They knew it was their fight, and they were determined to resist Russia in a way that Putin has miscalculated. So the best thing that Britain and Western countries can do at the moment is to step up the military assistance as we have been doing to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. Support.
I agree with Dominic Raab that, so forgive me. Do you agree with Dominic Raab's scepticism that a cornered Kremlin could step up its use of greater and more unconventional firepower, chemical, biological weapons, even nuclear weapons?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to finish what I was saying before, because the other thing that we must do in maintaining the international condemnation of Russia is also to press for an immediate ceasefire and then the withdrawal of Russian troops. But importantly, and this is a job for the United Nations, to make sure that we have humanitarian corridors maintained into these cities under Russian attack. In terms of Putin, we have seen from his record in Chechnya, where he bombed the capital Grozny almost to the ground and then sent in hit squads to assassinate individuals that continued to resist. We've seen in Syria, we've seen attacks on our own British soil, as well as him seizing the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, how dangerous this man is. And at the heart of this war is the danger of escalation. And the discipline and unity from NATO and from the West in putting in tough sanctions and making sure that we reinforce our NATO eastern flank, but saying to Putin, everything now depends on you being willing to negotiate and to start to de-escalate. It's Putin that's escalating, and it's Putin that must de-escalate if we're going to find a way through this war.
That isn't quite an answer to, if I may say so, to a question I asked. Dominic Raab said he thought that all of the talk about a nuclear alert and so on was just rhetoric. He would not go there. Do you agree?
Well, at times of extreme crisis like this, what senior political figures say matters. Putin has been used to ramping up rhetoric. He's also been willing to step up very aggressive military action, as we've seen in other countries. It should redouble our determination to support the Ukrainian resistance, but also to try and find a negotiated solution as we remain united as a Western alliance in saying to Russia, you may be making short-term military gains in Ukraine, but you will fail in the longer run.
You've criticised the government for being slow on sanctions. I talked to Mr. Raab about that a moment ago. What would Labour do about General Shoigu or indeed about Mr. Abramovich, neither of whom are on, as far as we know, on the UK sanctions list?
Yeah, we've been arguing for some time, for nearly 6 years, since the scale of the dirty money that helped keep Putin in power washing through London, that action's been required. And for 6 years, we've been arguing for the economic crime bill that the House of Commons only tomorrow will get to debate for the first time. So the sanctions that the government has been willing to put in place, the legislation it's had in order to do so, has been faulty and flawed for too long. And so that's why Keir Starmer this morning is saying to the government, look, finally, this economic crime bill is important. It will give us some of the legislative and economic weapons we don't yet have, but it needs toughening up. And if the government will work with Labour to do that during the passage of this legislation rapidly through the House of Commons and Lords, we will give them full cooperation in doing so.
This invasion has forced, I think, many people to rethink stances that they've had about things for a long time. Sweden now plans to spend more on defence. So does Germany. Will Labour support a significant increase in the UK's military spending?
Well, Labour backed the big increase in capital spending the Prime Minister announced in late 2020. I would expect to see a big boost to defence in the budget in 2 weeks' time. The government must respond to increased threats and increased threats to our security in Europe, just as Labour did when we were in government after the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers.
John Healey, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Ukrainians are waking up to day 11 of war. British military intelligence has said that both the scale and the strength of the Ukrainian resistance have continued to frustrate the Russian invasion. Aid agencies estimate the number of Ukrainian refugees could reach 1.5 million this weekend. Ukrainian citizen Anastasia Krishka joins us now from near Kiev. Good morning, Anastasia.
Morning. Hi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us, well, first of all, tell us how you personally are and what is the situation on the ground where you are?
Well, now it's relatively safe where I am. The first 2 days I've actually spent in the Kiev city center with my boyfriend, and then we had a chance to kind of escape to the Kiev area nearby. We still hear a lot of explosions and shootings and everything. So even though it is safe-ish, you can't really be safe right now anywhere in Ukraine. So, but I am like in the house. We have food, we have electricity and light and everything. So I am lucky, if you may say, compared to other people who are in much, much worse situations than we are.
Where you are you able to move around at all, or are you confined to the dwelling?
We don't leave the house. I haven't left the house in over 10 days. The only outside that I go is like the little outside garden that we have here on the actual like house garden, where we can walk our dog, and that's it. I haven't gone outside. My boyfriend did. He goes sometimes to get some food, and even though that's still a challenge because all the nearby shops, they don't have anything pretty much. You have to get there like really early to get like some milk and maybe one loaf of bread, and that's pretty much it.
What is the most difficult part of what you're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
fear of not knowing, of like whether you're gonna make it. Sorry, if you're gonna make it or not till the morning, basically, because you don't know where they will shoot next or where they will come next, and that's definitely the most terrifying part. But finally, I got a chance to get my parents here because they were also in the Kiev city center and they didn't want to leave. And I was begging them because we're actually in the house with my boyfriend's parents. And I had a chance to get my parents here 2 days ago. And I'm kind of like more at peace, but still it's terrifying to be here.
I can tell how difficult it is. You are in contact on social media, I think, with a lot of other people, particularly young Ukrainians. What are you hearing from them?
Well, I have a lot of Ukrainian friends and friends all over the world because I actually went to school and uni in England. So I have people all over the world and Ukrainians as well. And what I see on social media is remarkable, because everyone is trying to help each other, and everyone who even has like 100 followers, they're trying to spread the word as much as possible and help us, because I have a lot of Ukrainian friends who are now not in Ukraine and they're doing so much for us. And yeah, the community that we have here is truly inspiring. And we've always been very, very loyal to our country, very loving of our country, very proud to be Ukrainians. But at this point, it's just got to next level, absolute crazy level, where people who never spoke, they don't know each other. They're from different ends of Ukraine, and Ukraine is big. They are willing to put their life down to help someone else. And we have so many volunteers, tragically, who have been killed on the way to help others. Yeah.
What would you have the chance to speak to people all over the world. What would you like the rest of the world to be doing?
Well, I would like to say thank you to everyone who is helping. That's really, really, we're very grateful. But what I want to really say is that we're not as far as you think. What's happening here is not as far from you as you might think. What's happening here can tragically, unfortunately, happen to anyone at this point, because the dictator, our neighbor, the Mr. Putin, he's a madman, and no one knows what's in his mind. He's been bombing our nuclear power plant, you know, the biggest one in Europe, one of the biggest, and everyone knows Chernobyl. And if this tragedy happens, that's 6 times bigger. And no one's going to be able to hide or be, you know, that's away, that's in Ukraine, that's far. So I just want to say that we're not far. What's happening here is not far. And all the closing of the sky for us, at some point it could be too late. At some point, I just don't understand how many innocent lives have to be taken, the kids and everyone, for other people to finally understand that it has to be done. There is no point where you can be like, okay, yeah, now we can finally do it. It has to be done. It has to be done.
Anastasia, thank you very much indeed. And from us in London, Suchastya.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, could the UK be doing more to help the Ukraine defend itself? And if so, what could that mean for Britain's own security? Air Marshal Philip Osborn is a former Chief of Defence Intelligence and Director at Universal Defence and Security Solutions. He's here with me now. Good morning, Air Marshal.
Good morning.
Mr Zelensky and his people, just heard there, want the introduction of a no-fly zone, and that's been resisted. And we understand the formal reasons, but do you think that's going to be true forever?
I guess it depends where the West wants to end up. Excuse me. Militarily, you can put in place a no-fly zone. It's complex. It's dangerous. It has a risk associated with it militarily. But the issue, I think, is less the military reasons and much more the consequences. A while ago, I've been involved in policing no-fly zones. And the critical issue is you have to enforce them. What that means is not just threatening and sometimes shooting down opposition aircraft. It means targeting air defence systems that are trying to stop you operating in the no-fly zone. In this context, it would mean we'd have to be willing to attack Russian, perhaps Belarusian forces, not just in Ukraine, but perhaps in Belarus and perhaps in Russia. So that risk of escalation, significant escalation, and the quite clear path to further conflict is something that the West has got to be comfortable with, has got to be ready for if it implements a no-fly zone.
Do you think that the intelligence assessment that the politicians will be getting now would be saying you could do that, but in truth, rather than creating a situation in which the Russians and Belarusians can back off, it would be, on balance, a provocation for them to step up their firepower?
I think we have to perhaps take a step back here. Putin's in a hole. He's in a corner. He's personalised the conflict in Ukraine. And therefore, that brings with it all kinds of risks. His options are not nearly as clear as they were at the start of this conflict, only 11 days ago. But also at home, he really needs to maintain a narrative, maintain a rationale, which is where he's going at the moment, which is this is counter-NATO. This is to stop NATO expansionism. This is all about the security of Russia. Part of the implementation of a no-fly zone gives him that opportunity to underline that narrative at home, to make this about NATO and Russia, not about his miscalculation in Ukraine. So I think it is the options it gives him to step up into what he wants to be saying that is a real risk that the Western governments will be thinking about and being advised on.
OK, well, let's suppose that doesn't happen. Things proceed pretty much as they are now. Do you think... He's told President Macron in a phone call last week that he wants to control the whole of Ukraine. How realistic is that, given the size of that territory? 4 times the size of England, I think.
I think there's 2 things there. There's the size of the territory, we'll come back to that, but there's 40 million people that don't want him there, and they're showing every day with remarkable resistance, bravery, stoicism, that he just can't hold that country. I think any nation who thinks it's going to hold a country of 40 million plus people who just don't want you there, regardless of the size, is killing themselves. So he may be saying that taking over Ukraine, removing it as a supposed threat to Russia, is his end state. I just can't see him being advised, even by those yes men that surround him, that that's possible. And therefore, he must be looking for some kind of way out, perhaps partition, which allows him to shift the narrative to say, hey, look, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve. But I think we come back to, He's in a corner. This is not where he planned to be. He planned to have a puppet regime in place on day 2.
I mean, one of the other reasons that perhaps things haven't panned out in the way that he might have expected is that, as many analysts have said, they're rather surprised at what seems to be the poor performance of Russian forces. Has he got a white elephant on his hands? He spent a lot of money bringing those armed forces up to scratch, but they don't seem to be doing what he wants.
At the heart of military power is people. It's, have you got the right people with the right morale, the right training, and the right skills to do the type of things he's trying to do? So yes, you're right, there's a lot of expensive equipment, and a lot of it is stuck in muddy ditches in Ukraine at the moment. If we take a step back again, I think what we're seeing is a hugely overconfident Russian military engaging with the reality of a really high-end, well-equipped, highly motivated opponent. So I think we've seen an era of overconfidence as far as they're concerned, and they have underestimated the Ukrainians. That's led to tactical and operational level failures in terms of logistics, in terms of command and control. But what I think it's also underlined is that Russia's just not used to doing this type of stuff. Big, coordinated air, land, maritime operations on many axes are really difficult. And nations like the UK, the US and others train really hard to ensure you've got that capability. Russia's not been doing that.
Is one consequence of him being, as you put it, in a hole, that he simply just has to get, as it were, a bigger cudgel, i.e., more firepower, shelling of civilian targets, for example?
We're already there. I mean, what we're seeing is the Chechnya, is the Syria playbook. He was trying to be fast. He was trying to be manipulative of public opinion. You know, puppet regime, perhaps in 2 or 3 days. That's clearly not worked. His forces are proving that they're not nearly as agile as they thought they were going to be. And therefore, what we're seeing, tragically, is Russia doing what Russia normally does, which is when it's in a hole, it applies violence, extreme violence, to break civilian morale. I think personally, in the Ukrainians, they picked the wrong opponent.
And when we say extreme violence, how extreme? You know what I'm really asking here. What is he prepared to use?
In terms of in Ukraine, he'll be prepared to use cluster weapons. He's already seen those. He'll be prepared to use thermobaric weapons. We've seen those deployed. To go further than that, again, is to risk a highly significant escalation, which even those deluded individuals around Putin, I think, would be advising him against. This is a multi-level conflict, and actions at the tactical and operational level do have strategic impact. It's a dangerous time, and he'll recognise it's a dangerous time. So I would assess at this stage weapons beyond those conventional weapons of mass destruction that I've just mentioned. I can't see those being used within Ukraine in a tactical context.
Air Marshal Phil Osborn, thank you so much.
Thank you.
President Zelensky has repeated call for an immediate no-fly zone to protect civilians from aerial attack, but his pleas have so far fallen on deaf ears. So can and should NATO do more to save lives and deter Vladimir Putin? Earlier, I spoke to Kurt Volker, a former US ambassador to NATO and special representative for Ukraine negotiations in the Trump administration. When we spoke in January, you said that Mr. Putin had put all the forces in place for a large invasion, I'm quoting you there, and it was more likely than not that he would use them. Could we have done more to deter him?
Yes, it's unfortunate but true. You know, we could see it. We could see the buildup of forces. We heard his rhetoric. We knew he had made demands that could not be met. So it was just becoming increasingly clear that he would invade. I wasn't sure whether it would be trying to take over the whole country and depose the government or just take parts of eastern Ukraine. And sadly, what he is very clear about now is he wants to kill Zelensky, decapitate the government, and control the entire country.
And do you think that he really is completely bent on his war aim now, come what may, irrespective of casualties and international condemnation and so on?
Yes, in fact, I think he has given himself no way out. He launched this military operation on the thought that it might last 2 or 3 days. It would be fairly easy. They would take over Ukraine. Obviously not true. Russian forces are bogged down in many places. They've suffered a lot of casualties, a lot of equipment losses. And now these sanctions have kicked in that are truly significant against the Russian economy. So he has to win to save face, to save himself, to remain in power. Because if he fails in Ukraine and the economy is tanking, I would not be surprised to see people in Russia start to question his leadership.
Do you think this is what might be called the cornered rat problem? That actually, if you corner the rat, he or she will just become more savage and do things that in other circumstances would be unimaginable?
Yes, that's true. And we're seeing it already. So Russian, multiple rocket launchers are firing at civilian populations, apartment buildings and cities in Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kherson, in Kyiv, and missile strikes on civilian targets in cities. Aircraft, they haven't gained air superiority yet, but they are trying to, and they want to completely suppress the population by breaking its will and defeating the military on the battlefield.
Mr. Biden, in his State of the Union address this week, I think devoted not much more than about 10 minutes to Ukraine, which seems like a surprise given the circumstances. Do you think that was an indication that in reality the United States now thinks that there's relatively little it can do to change the course of Mr. Putin's actions?
Well, first off, I do want to give President Biden credit on two fronts. One of them, he did speak extensively about Ukraine. 10 minutes in a State of the Union is significant, and it's the first topic he brought up. So he gave it some priority. And secondly, his rhetoric about defending democracy and standing up to Putin's aggression, I thought that rhetoric was great. The problem is that the actions have not matched that rhetoric. And we have been intimidated by Russia, I would say, fearing that he might reach for a nuclear weapon, fearing a direct conflict with Russian forces that could escalate. And so rather than deterring Russia, he is deterring us.
Well, you've set out this week in an article a number of things that you think that the West, that NATO could be doing. And in particular, you've taken note of what the Ukrainians themselves have been saying, that they want NATO to establish a no-fly zone. You've called for that in a more limited fashion, I think, than President Zelensky's talked about, to cover Kiev and humanitarian routes out of the Ukraine. How would that work?
Well, first off, we've done this in the past. We've executed no-fly zones. We've done it over the Kurdish areas in Iraq, for example, when Saddam Hussein was attacking them. So we know how to do this. There is a protocol for this. Secondly, we make very clear this is for humanitarian purposes only. We are there to prevent attacks on the civilian population from the air. And we do this over Kiev and Western Ukraine, so it's limited geographically. We are not coming close to Russian borders. And we make very clear the rules of engagement. We will not be striking any ground targets, any Russian forces, unless fired upon. And we will not be striking any Russian aircraft or helicopters, provided they remain outside the zone. And if they enter the zone, then there's a protocol of escalating tactics to escort them out. But if they refuse, then there would be the prospect of firing on them. But many ways to avoid that. And I think the Russians will understand this as well. They might test us, but then I think they don't want to draw us into a larger conflict either.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that. Do you really think that Mr. Putin is going to play by rules that NATO has set out? He hasn't been interested in NATO, what NATO's had to say about anything thus far.
Yeah, I think it's force that he respects. It's force that he listens to, not the rules that are stated. So if he sees that we are doing it and we are prepared to follow through, I think he will adjust.
But of course, what people worry about is that his reaction might not be the reasonable one that you've just set out, but simply to say, this is an act of war. We are now at war. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to win this war with every force at my disposal. And we know what that means, including chemical, biological, and nuclear.
Yeah, which would be horrific. And if that is the kind of dictator and aggressor that we are dealing with in Europe today, then we also know he won't stop at Ukraine. He wants to subdue Ukraine. He'll move on to Moldova. I think that was already in the plans. He'll look at Georgia, and he may even be looking at the Baltic states, which we have an obligation to defend. So I think it is prudent to take steps now to assist the Ukrainians as they have an organized government and military and are fighting back, rather than waiting until it is disorganized in Ukraine and Putin is in a dominant position and moving on to other pieces of the empire.
Let me ask you, I guess, a question that I put to you in our previous interview. If we don't, for example, introduce a no-fly zone, is it your view that ultimately the Ukrainians are going to have to submit to Russian control?
No, I think the Ukrainians are going to continue fighting. And even if the Russians manage to kill Zelensky, and even if they manage to break the military organization, then the Ukrainians will be fighting from the cities and the woods in an internal insurgency against a Russian occupying force. This is going to go on regardless.
So this is potentially what our own Foreign Secretary called, before the invasion, the potential for a quagmire for the Russians. I think she was calling to mind Afghanistan, maybe the first Chechen war.
Yeah, the difference between a quagmire, as we would understand it, and what would be happening in Ukraine under those circumstances is the Russians are absolutely brutal. They won't play by any rules of nicety. They will kill civilians indiscriminately. They will be incredibly brutal. And that is, again, another reason we should be looking at ways to stop this before it happens.
Let me just ask you lastly one thing which, as a former official, you've served under a number of presidents, including President Trump. It's been said to me, actually, on television this week, that were President Trump in the White House, Mr. Putin would never have dared to be so audacious, so brutal, so aggressive. Do you agree with that?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know. I think there is an element to which President Trump was highly unpredictable. And I think Putin was not sure what Trump would do. I also think that he believed that Trump was comfortable using force. Look at the way we took out the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or pushed back in Syria and against ISIS. There was a bit of aggressiveness in the approach, which I think Putin saw, and that also increased uncertainty. But that being said, Putin is bent on this mission to rebuild the Russian Empire on the ashes of the former Soviet Union. He wants to regather the territories. He's been explicit about it. And so I think his being driven to do this would be the case whether it was President Trump or President Biden.
Countries in the West and elsewhere have so far used economic sanctions as the main weapon to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine. Said to be the strongest ever imposed against Moscow, it remains to be seen whether they will be enough to force Vladimir Putin to think again. Tom Keatinge is a financial security expert at the Royal United Services Institute, and he joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Keatinge.
Good morning.
Boris Johnson insisted at Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday that Britain is, quote, leading the way when it comes to sanctions on Russia. Is that claim justified?
Well, the UK should be leading the way. We have a global financial centre full of Russian banks, full of Russian money, full of Russian investment, and therefore we absolutely have to lead the way. And when you look at the numbers, the government would argue, yes. However, the government has put out there that targeting oligarchs is a measure, and on that measure, the UK is not leading the way.
When you say, well, who else is ahead of us, as it were?
Well, the European Union and the US have moved faster on individuals. I think the government here has recognized that they have tied themselves up in knots with their sanctions law. But it is clearly the case that when it comes to freezing central bank assets and other parts of financial infrastructure, the UK is definitely taking a lead.
Do you think that the situation that you've described, that at some level we're lagging behind others, will have been an encouragement to oligarchs to basically start moving their wealth? I mean, the sort of marquee example is what Mr. Abramovich has been doing at Chelsea.
Any oligarch worth their billions of dollars, I'm afraid, will have contingency plans in place. So we've seen yachts moving around the world. We've seen private jets moving around the world. Of course, not all assets can be moved quickly. You can't sell a £45 million house in London overnight. But we can certainly expect these individuals to put up a tremendous fight if they are sanctioned in the UK eventually.
Do you think that the focus that there has been on individual big names, and I've mentioned one, I spoke to Mr. Raab about others, and has been helpful?
I don't think so. I can see how it's appealing to say oligarchs can't hide their money here. And indeed, the UK has had a decades-long problem with dirty Russian money in London and elsewhere in the country. So this is not to say we should be ignoring this problem. We've ignored it for too long, and we have seen the results of ignoring that. But fundamentally, what we need to be doing is crushing the Russian economy. Going after oligarchs helps because these are the people who, if anyone can whisper in Putin's ear, it is them. But in reality, I think making oligarchs the marquee, the measure by which you're going to judge the progress you're making, I think has been unhelpful for the government.
You've in fact described the current financial sanctions as toothless. Is that a bit harsh?
That was my response initially. I think the West was weak initially in its first response. The whole point of sanctions is to deter Putin, and at the first opportunity to show that we were strong and we meant business, we fluffed it. Since then, I must say, the sanctions, particularly on financial infrastructure, on the central bank, have been very strong. So I wouldn't say they were toothless. However, there is an elephant in the room here, which is sanctions on energy, on gas and on oil, major contributors to the Russian economy. And of course, so far, those remain untouched.
What would we do, or what should we do, from your point of view, on those sectors?
I think there are two things. Obviously, the EU in particular has an addiction to Russian gas. That is not something that's going to change overnight. On oil, if we remember back to the Iran era, on oil, basically, countries were told you don't have to cut off your purchase of Iranian oil overnight, but you need to demonstrate month on month that you are reducing your imports. So I think that needs to be a near-term and urgent mission, which the UK should be leading on that as well.
In fact, I seem to recall that the Obama administration had a sort of staggered program of sanctions over time, which essentially, I suppose, was meant to put the squeeze. Is that the sort of thing you have in mind?
Yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing I have in mind. I mean, energy, if we don't sanction energy, then we are not sanctioning the Russian economy to the extent that the Foreign Secretary and others have called for. The most massive consequences will be if we indeed go now after energy.
Of course, you said at the beginning of this conversation that London was in a special place because there's so much money of different kinds flowing through here. And there's a lot of conversation about dirty money. Let me ask you, practically, do you think we can actually get at this so-called dirty money? Because some of it doesn't come directly from Russia. The people whose names are mentioned on the deeds for the properties, and they're owned by companies in jurisdictions like the Caymans or Cyprus or somewhere else. Do you think actually we're really going to be able to get at this money?
It's really important not to mistake taking sanctions action against Russia for dealing with the UK's dirty money problem. Dealing with the UK's dirty money problem needs to be done by building our defences, strengthening our defences. So this is why this economic crime bill, which is coming forward, is so important. That will bring transparency to foreign ownership of property in the UK, for example. Sanctions does not deal with dirty money. Sanctions freezes the assets of those who are committing human rights abuses or destabilizing and invading Ukraine. But we have to build our defenses domestically to stop dirty money coming into this country. We then need to do our best to try and identify the dirty money that's here already. That's very challenging, but not building our defenses up is inexcusable.
One of the oligarchs has said publicly, and I think some of them have been saying privately, why are you getting after us? Because we really have no influence over Mr. Putin. And one has to say that there is some, there's some evidence that almost nobody has influence over Mr. Putin. And getting after these guys may make us feel better, but may not have any impact whatsoever on Putin.
Yeah, I mean, there are two important points on that. Firstly, the UK sanctions law says that those who have benefited from or support the Russian government can be subject to sanction. So there is no doubt that these individuals have benefited from being close to the Russian government over the year. And indeed, many would argue that in some cases they are guardians of Putin's wealth. They haven't become wealthy without his blessing, and his blessing comes with a price tag. So I think to say that we don't have influence, that might be right, but to say we haven't benefited and therefore we're not somehow connected to this regime is just straight wrong.
Tom Keatinge, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you.
The UK economy was already under growing pressure from rising prices and supply chain issues before the Ukraine crisis. But now experts predict things could get even worse. I'm joined by Rain Newton-Smith, the chief economist at the Confederation of British Industry. Good morning, Mr. Newton-Smith.
Good morning.
Let's talk about energy, which has come up a number of times already this morning. How serious is the rise in costs going to be for business?
I think it is serious, but I think first and foremost, all of our thoughts at the moment are with the people in Ukraine. And I think if you talk to most businesses at the moment in the UK, the things they are most concerned about is what is their role and how can they help with the humanitarian efforts to support people fleeing from Ukraine, and what can they do to implement the economic sanctions that are in place most effectively. So I think that is what is first and foremost in any business's minds. You're right, though, as we look at the fallout for what this means for the UK economy and for the global economy, one of the biggest impacts that we are seeing now and will see in future is higher energy prices and higher inflation. And that will put more pressure on ordinary households in the UK. But I think we have to caveat that in that the thing that is foremost in people's minds is this conflict we're seeing in Ukraine and how we can help support people there and also citizens here.
Well, I want to come to that in a moment, but I should ask you really, British businesses presumably have quite a lot of employees in Ukraine and also in Russia. What are your thoughts about the risks to those individuals, and what are businesses doing to protect them?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really difficult time for any business who has staff in Ukraine or in Russia, and they are asking themselves some really difficult questions. And I think first and foremost, it's of course supporting any staff or operations you have in Ukraine, making sure that they are safe. And of course, many businesses here in the UK have British Ukrainian staff working for them who have families who are impacted by this dreadful conflict. So our thoughts are definitely with them. And of course, there are businesses as well who will have operations in Russia, who will have staff employed in Russia. And what we've seen is many businesses have made really difficult decisions to either close their operations in Russia. But one of the things that first and foremost is to make sure that the staff that they have in Russia are also safe. So I don't think there are any easy decisions for businesses here, but first and foremost, they're thinking about the safety of their staff, then how they can implement the economic sanctions as effectively as possible, and how, and ultimately their responsibilities to create jobs here in the UK and to ensure that they're able to continue to produce goods and services to their customers and clients.
To return to the point we were discussing a moment ago on energy, it is still, I think, the issue of the moment for businesses and for economic ministers, the question of what we do about the effect of sanctions on the energy sector. Obviously, much more sensitive, I guess, on continental Europe, but still a problem for us, partly because I think you said at the CBI that any disruption in the European gas supply chain with Russia could have a more severe shock on the whole market than we currently anticipate. Could you explain what you have in mind there and what impact it would have on people here?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to separate out there. First of all, the biggest impact we're seeing on energy prices, and that's of course both oil but also natural gas, is not actually from direct sanctions at the moment. It's from the conflict already that is happening. And so I think it isn't just about the sanctions, it's about the fact that we're facing a war in Europe, and that is having an impact on energy prices directly. And secondly, I think what we do know in the UK in terms of our own exposure is around 5% of our natural gas imports are from Russia. For Europe, it's much higher. It's about 40% of all natural gas. So that gives you a sense of our sort of direct exposure. But I think what we're seeing happening here in the UK, and we were seeing this impact before the conflict really escalated, is that we are facing high energy prices. That has a big impact on households primarily. In April, the energy price cap went up as a result of the fact that energy prices are much higher globally. And again, in October, we'll likely see a further increase in energy prices that households are facing. And of course, that's most challenging for low-income households who spend a bigger proportion of their income on heating their homes. So I think there's the squeeze on households. But the other issue that we face is, of course, for businesses themselves, higher energy prices means higher costs for their operations. And I think an example you can give of that is particularly like in the ceramics industry. So if you're a brick manufacturer, energy cost is a big part of what you are, of the costs that you face, and that's suddenly gone up significantly. So I think what's important is that the UK government thinks about the impact on households and does what they can to support particularly low-income households through this transition, but also thinks about some of those businesses, particularly smaller businesses who face big costs from energy, and think about how they smooth the transition to these higher energy prices. And there's something called the Recovery Loan Scheme, which was put in place partly to help businesses through COVID. That could be extended for another 6 months to really help some of those smaller businesses who are suddenly facing a much more challenging economic environment here in the UK.
Finally, just returning to the specific issue of sanctions, I know that you have spent a lot of time studying China's role in the global economy. One thing I think hasn't been talked about too much yet is whether China might play a role in either reinforcing or being neutral to, or actually undermining sanctions through its new economic relationship with Russia. Do you think that Beijing could in fact come to Moscow's rescue if sanctions start to bite?
I mean, I think that's really a question for the Chinese government. I think what's most important at the moment is that for economic sanctions to work effectively, we need international coordination. And I think what would be a real shame or a bad outcome from is that if the UK and other governments retreat from some of that international cooperation. I think what we saw last year through the G7, where the UK was leading that presidency, and what we've seen as well through the G20, where countries across emerging markets come together to work effectively. And we need to see more international coordination. And we need to work with China to make these economic sanctions work effectively. And I think that's what we need to see, is all countries reaching out to other governments to work effectively. And I think it's important that we don't retreat from globalization, that we don't retreat from those conversations and international diplomacy. I think that would be a real travesty for the UK, but also for the world economy if we don't engage in some of these international forums, we don't work with the UN and other countries to implement these sanctions as effectively as possible, and continuing to trade within the remit of these economic sanctions.
Ray Newton-Smith, CBI, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, despite widespread international condemnation of the attack on Ukraine, one of Russia's most important allies, China, has been much less critical, as we've just been hearing. Nevertheless, many believe Putin's actions have left Beijing in an awkward place, with a key strategic partner that it's grown closer to over recent years. Earlier, I spoke to Yun Sun, a political analyst and director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. China's leadership has been very muted, really, in its response to the invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that they anticipated this in any way?
I think they were anticipating Russia to do something, at least by the beginning of February. I think the Chinese sense is that, well, Russia has what they call legitimate security concerns. And during Putin's trip to Beijing, I think the Chinese speculation is that, well, there's probably some Russian actions to come in the months to come. But I think the Chinese were not expecting Russia to launch a full-scale invasion into Ukraine. The most they saw that Moscow would do would be a repetition of what they did in Crimea in 2014. So help the two territories in eastern Ukraine to become independent through a referendum and Russian support. So they will basically achieve Russia's goal of addressing its security concerns, but without a full-scale invasion. So the full-scale invasion part definitely came as a shock to the Chinese. And the Chinese think that it's overdone, it's uncalled for.
Oh, right. Where do you think it leaves their relationship with Moscow then? Because that relationship was being built up and was looking pretty close.
Well, it looks pretty close. But if you look at what China, Russia, their strategic agenda is in the international system, they don't want the same thing. The Chinese has seen themselves as a beneficiary of the international system. And Putin caused the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is the biggest tragedy. And the same international system that China has benefited from has treated Russia as a victim. So in that sense, the Russian strategy has been one of strategy of chaos. So basically strengthening Russia's bargaining power and manipulation through a strategy of chaos. But the Chinese do not prefer instability in the international system because it disrupts what the Chinese want to achieve. They do have a shared common threat, which is the United States. And that's also the most salient factor that has brought Beijing and Moscow together. But this does not mean that the two countries are allies and they share the same ideology, same value, and same desired endgame in the international system.
Is that how you would explain their decision to abstain in the Security Council vote criticizing the invasion?
Well, one bottom line of China's policy towards Russia is that China will not make Russia its enemy. That is a bottom line. And that is a lesson that China learned during the Cold War, basically starting in late 1960s. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Chinese biggest national security concern and threat was from Soviet Union. And using the Chinese word, because of the 1 million troops that Soviet Union deployed along the border with China, China was forced to drop its national development agenda for 2 decades in order to deal with its Russia threat. So if you look at China's behavior pattern, there is a pattern that, well, it does not pose itself as a direct opponent to Russia. But on issues that China does not necessarily agree with Russia, China will pick a position such as the abstention that we saw from the UN Security Council this time. And this is also what China did in 2014. China also abstained at the time when Russia annexed Crimea. But on the other hand, to this date, China has not yet acknowledged Russian sovereignty over Crimea. So I wouldn't say this is a one-sided position. I would say this is a balancing act.
Do you think that we can't expect China to apply sanctions in the way the West is trying to do to Russia? But do you think that Beijing will at any point have the will and, more importantly, the capacity to say to Mr. Putin, stop?
Well, I don't see why China would. Well, there are reasons like diplomatic embarrassment, and there are also things like China does not want to become as being seen as the accomplice of Russia in this current Ukraine crisis. But on the other hand, when China looks at the international system or international affairs down the road, the Chinese question is that will this in any way improve China's future outlook in its relations, for example, with the United States and its relations with the West? And the Chinese feel that, well, if I tell Russia to back off, the end result or the end consequences for China would be China will make an enemy out of Russia, and the West will still remain to be China's enemy. So in that sense, I think the Chinese calculation is that, well, they will continue to muddle through. They will not come out to directly oppose Russia, which is why I argue the decisive actions and the clear positions that the international community desires out of China is unlikely to transpire.
Might there be a material or objective pressure on China ultimately, though, to take a decision because of the economic costs imposed by sanctions? It's said widely that China needs a 6% growth and that sanctions are almost certainly going to take a hammer to the world economy. So might that be a reason for China to, as it were, get off the fence?
Well, here are two issues. One is a strategic orientation, and the other one is technical calculations. I think in this case, given the context of the US-China great power competition or the strategic competition and now the attention being given to Taiwan, I think the Chinese strategic orientation is going to be, well, we cannot abandon Russia. And down the road, we probably have to continue to align our positions with Russia because we do share this anti-US agenda. But it doesn't mean that on the technical level and the working level, the Chinese operations or their actions cannot be influenced. I think that's where the economic sanctions will play an important role in shaping the Chinese tactical operations and tactical positions, which means that, for example, China has been the largest trading partner of Russia. But if there is a sanction pressure, maybe we can bring down the level of revenue that China is creating for Russia. And China has been a main financier to Russia in terms of its domestic project. But if the Chinese banks are going to carry severe financial consequences for their loaning or their financing decisions to Russia, then maybe we cannot completely break it off or completely eliminate Chinese financing to Russia, but at least we can curtail its level. So I think that's where the sanctions will come in, but do not expect the sanctions to completely change China's position on Russia.
They say the first casualty of any war is truth. State-controlled media in Russia has been making sure that thought is being kept front and centre in its coverage, thought control, I should say, it's front and centre in its coverage of the Ukraine conflict. On Friday, a new law was passed by the Russian military threatening anyone who intentionally spreads fake news about the military with up to 15 years in jail. Ruth Smeath is the CEO of Index on Censorship, and she joins me now. Good morning, Ruth. What did you make of this new law?
Good morning, Trevor. I mean, I wish I was surprised about the law, but we've seen a continuing attack in Russia on free speech and on media freedom. But what we've seen over the last 48 hours is unprecedented. The Voice of America, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, Medusa, Radio Free Europe, which is obviously so relevant for when we're talking about anything in Eastern Europe, and Radio Liberty have all shut up shop. We've got newspapers and media outlets across Russia who have had to stop their work. Some of those who had been so extraordinarily brave this time last week. We saw the editor of Novaya Gazeta talking about his paper and how they were putting the front cover was the flag of Ukraine. They've now stopped covering what's happening in Ukraine upon fear of prosecution and of going to prison for 15 years. There is no longer any free media operating in Russia. And I would to the extent that even the Scientist magazine in Russia has been suspended by the state regulator because 7,500 scientists signed an open letter saying that the war was wrong. And there is literally no media pluralism. There is no free media left in Russia.
And I think it's not just legal, or, law, the law that's being used. Actually, there's some informal, I suppose you could call them, methods being used. And I just want to show you a clip of something from the Sky News crew. Our colleague Stuart Ramsey did a report yesterday.
The Ukrainian people are being attacked from the air, from artillery, from ground troops and tanks. The debris of this war litters every street. But the government has warned for days of Russian saboteurs who've infiltrated the country to bring terror. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Well, we will be showing more of that on the channel, but we can see Stuart's report later this evening. But this is something that's affecting journalists throughout this, isn't it? Foreign journalists as well as those domestic to Belarus and Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean, we should never be more grateful for the bravery of the journalists who are out there and who are staying. But what they're facing cannot be underestimated, cannot be understated. They are literally, their lives are in their hands at the moment, or rather in the hands of Russian forces. It is absolutely appalling. Freedom of expression is protected under the UN Charter, and yet we are seeing a daily attack on both on the individuals who are trying to make sure that people have news and have information, and on the platforms that provide those news. So we've seen social media platforms being blocked. We've seen huge numbers of internet sites being taken down by the state regulator. This is unprecedented in a Western context, really.
And just very briefly, Ruth, our own journalists are facing their own challenges here from oligarchs and rich Russians.
They are, and we've seen a series of lawsuits that are targeting journalists and authors. They're called SLAPs. And on Monday evening, the Economic Crime Bill, there is an amendment that we've been working really closely with politicians on, that's led by David Davis and Liam Byrne, to stop SLAPs, to make sure that journalists in the UK are not subject to attacks, to lawfare, really, in a UK legal system. We've seen two really high-profile cases in the last 6 months. Catherine Belchin and her book on Putin's People, unsurprisingly, she ended up in court, but it nearly broke her. And Tom Burgess, again in the last 10 days, who wrote about kleptocracy even. So we've seen huge attacks on them and trying to shut down conversation in a European, in a British context, to make sure that criticism of what's happening in Russia can't continue. Okay. We have to change the law to make sure that we have free speech in the UK too.
Ruth, thank you so much. You can see Stuart Ramsey's full report on that awful incident at 9:30 tonight here on Sky News. Well, that is it from us. This is, in fact, my last show on the Sunday morning. Though if you want some more punishment, you can see me on Monday and Tuesday nights in upcoming shows. But next Sunday, the wonderful Sophie Ridge is back in her rightful seat. And I just want to say thanks to Sophie for giving me the opportunity. Thanks to Sam Coates and the team, Gallery and Floor. Politics matters. And it's important that we here still choose our leaders. Others are not so lucky.